Welcome. We'll get started. Let me start with a few announcements. At tonight's course dinner, the theme is socialization processes at Harvard. How does this institution shape us? And if you're willing to share your thoughts on that question, that's 6 to 7 in the Leverett House private dining room tonight. Tomorrow we have our last course film night, and we're showing A Man for All Seasons in the original and better version of the two versions of that film. It tells the story of a British Archbishop, Thomas More, and his unwillingness to flatter King Henry VIII. The film raises rich questions about whether and how to be an independent moral agent in defiance of persons and institutions with great power. And that will be tomorrow at 7:30 in Science Center D, D as in despair. Afterwards, as an optional extra after the film, we will be showing a 17-minute film about some of the guests from a course I taught a year ago, Globalization and Human Values, Envisioning World Community. And that's a short film that gives an overview of that course. This Friday, we are interviewing Jonathan Kozel, and we've already read 3 of his essays in the course source book. And recently by email, I circulated one of his pieces about the lives of children in the South Bronx. May I ask for your attention, those who are still conversing? Thanks. Today's guest has agreed to stay afterwards for a smaller group discussion, and we will have that after stopping at 4. It is perilous to introduce a person who has written about the harmful effects of certain forms of praise, especially when that person is as brilliant and courageous as Alfie Kohn. But I will make the attempt. In Swedish, as you know, there is a phrase, samhällsdebattör, society debater. And a samhällsdebattör, a society debater, is someone who raises questions about where the society is heading and where it ought to go, often one who raises difficult questions. And Alfie Kohn is such a samhällsdebattör for our society, as one of our great educational philosophers, but one who challenges beliefs that are very widespread in the society. The assumption that more competition is always a good thing. The belief that more and tougher testing will benefit our children. The enthusiasm for military solutions to global problems. And he has done this work through 8 books, which have been published in 9 languages, as well as through public work such as appearances on the Today Show and Oprah, and he's the author or subject of articles in such publications as the Wall Street Journal, the Harvard Business Review, Time Magazine, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. And we've read his just published book, What Does It Mean to Be Well Educated? In his visit today, we'll have a chance to think about the issues raised there and questions of the shape of education at this institution and in our society. But it'll also be a chance to think about how one becomes such an effective public advocate as Alfie Kohn. Please join me in welcoming Alfie Kohn.
Thank you. Thanks. Delighted to be here. Who has a question? Who is authorized to begin asking a question may be the better way to proceed here.
We start with Charlie Griffin.
This is how Brian gets his exercise.
Hi, thanks for being here. In your work, you focus on stimulating students' natural tendencies to learn. What educational experiences were most successful in stimulating these tendencies in you, and what can we learn from them?
What educational experiences did I have that stimulated what I write about in terms of learning? Is that?
Yeah, pretty much.
If I missed something, everything I needed to know I did not learn in kindergarten or elementary school or high school or college or graduate school. I may have come into those experiences with a contrarian tendency already somewhat in place, and I can't explain why that is. If you read that Washington Post profile, it led with the story of my writing busy work on a 5th grade paper, but that sort of characterized a lot of my schooling, which was against much of what I was getting. I was a good student in conventional terms, which I guess gave me some latitude for taking things on. When I was in 9th grade, I publicly refused an award that had been given to me by the American Legion, which to my surprise elicited quite a bit of national publicity. That was my 5 minutes of fame at the age of 14. And I continued to challenge things as well. I guess your question is not so much about who I am and what I did in school, so much as what kind of schooling experience was I part of and whether it affected. Yes? I went to a too big, two-tracked suburban high school where, like most high school students, the high points had more to do with seeing my friends than with authentic intellectual stimulation. Then I went to Brown, and I found a different world with a lot of people who were more like me, and I decided that even there I had to take advantage of one of the things Brown offered, which was to create my own major, or concentration as they call it there, which is called normativism. They had to translate that into Latin on my diploma for reasons that escape me. But I wasn't just taking the world as I was given, and there are a lot of things there too that I didn't like. And I guess one of the things I've found in my life is that you can learn as much from less than optimal situations and structures and the need to rebel against them as you can from places that are already quite terrific. You can learn a lot about being a good parent by being brought up by people who aren't such good parents. And the same thing is true with teaching and managing and other things like that, where you figure out what's less than ideal and how, if it were up to me, would I do things otherwise. The kind of things I talk about educationally, I experienced very little of up through 12th grade. The classes were all about filling people with facts so they could do well on tests. And it took me some years after that to figure out it could have been otherwise. And the more information I had, including being a teacher, I was a high school teacher for a while, and I didn't realize until sometime after that my classroom could have been otherwise, and I wasn't nearly as good as I thought I was at the time. I was a good lecturer who cared about his subject. I liked kids, and I really made a point of understanding what I was teaching. But in some important ways, that class was all about me. And that's more about teaching than it is about learning. So I drew from many sources: research, thinking, conversations, and watching other teachers who were more skilled than I was in helping to formulate the ideas. In short, I guess I'd have to say there's no simple cause and effect relationship between the kind of schooling I had and the kinds of things I now talk about.
Rachel Bloomkatz.
Hi, thanks for being here. Many of our guests here in class have talked about how their values and actions influence the way they raise their children. Often there are complex conflicts as one wants to criticize common norms and change the status quo, but at the same time raise happy and successful children. My question is, how do you engage with your children? Do you feel this conflict that other speakers have addressed? And do you really resist saying good job as you put over on your website?
I wrote a book about 10 years ago called Punished by Rewards, which drew from hundreds of studies to argue that rewards, including praise, grades, bonus plans, and other carrots that are dangled in front of people, tend to be counterproductive, not only ineffective. And I heard from many people after I had written this book that this was all well and good, but wait till you have kids. And I asked a friend of mine about this and whether things would change once I had kids. And he said, oh no. No, because then they'll say, but you only have one kid. And if you have two, they'll say, but what gender? Your lessons don't apply to me. And if you have one of each, as in fact I do now, they'll say, yeah, but you don't have my kids. So people will always find a way to discredit or write out lessons that they are unwilling to hear and unready to accept. I wrote an afterword to the 1999 edition of that book, in which by that point I had a daughter who was about 4, and talked about my experiences and how I came to appreciate more directly the challenge involved in raising kids more than you can ever appreciate just by being one or by watching other people who have them. And I appreciated more directly the siren song of punishments and rewards to control kids. But having said that, I have found still no reason to challenge what I already knew was true from research and from my own other experiences besides parenting, including being in the classroom. Things work out better when you work with people than when you do things to people. And that's true when the people are really short. It's true in all experiences I know. In fact, the older I get, the more I tend to believe that you can measure someone's character based on their ability to resist the temptation to use the power they have or think they have in order to make people with less power do what they want. It's challenging, of course. You know, Winston Churchill famously said 60 years ago that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all the others. And that, in fact, turns out to be true in corporations and classrooms and to some extent, with certain caveats, in families, because people don't like being done to. For me, I was ready to face the challenges of parenting on one level, though there are some things I was not ready to face, like the sheer amount of laundry I was not prepared for, and a number of other things as well about parenting. It's much, much harder than one can ever imagine, especially if you care to do it well. But as I grapple with this, and with the wondrous people I have this relationship with, I'm always thinking about the ideas that I'm writing about and have been writing about even before I was a parent. Hence, it leads to some gulps and some possibilities of inconsistency, such as when my wife says to me after an interaction with one of my children, "Is that something Alfie Kohn would have recommended saying?" And the answer often is no, which is very unsettling. The praise part in particular, if anything, I have grown more certain about. What children need, as I'll be arguing in my next book, which I just finished but won't be out until next year, it takes at least a year. I'm not like Chomsky, you know. Howard Zinn says, I can't read books as fast as Noam can write them, you know. But I have a book coming out next year for parents and about parenting. The first time I've addressed that explicitly and exclusively. Not the first time explicitly, but the first time exclusively. And that book, which is tentatively called Unconditional Parenting, talks about the extent to which rewards, including praise, are counterproductive, not just because they are extrinsic inducements that have the effect of undermining intrinsic motivation, as I argued in pieces of the book you read, but for another reason too. What children need desperately, what we all need, is to be able to really screw up and fall short and still know that we're worthwhile people. That's unconditional support, where you don't have to earn the approval or attention or acknowledgement of important people in your life. You have it. Praise is the opposite of that. It's not just different from that. Praise says, good job when you jump through my hoops and impress me. That is precisely what people do not need. They need love and support that's always there, and excitement when there are accomplishments and excitement-worthy moments, of course, but not in such a way that the message kids get in classrooms or in families is, I have to be well-behaved, I have to get good grades, I have to be good at sports, I have to be polite, I have to do anything in order to know that my parents are pleased and excited. Praise doesn't do that. So my wife, who, by the way, this was the hardest part of all of the things I teach about for her when we met each other, and those ideas were just taking form. They were nascent. And she wasn't sure she bought that part with the praise, because, as she readily admits, my wife is hooked on praise. And even as an adult, even as a physician, still often needs that patronizing pat on the head from a supervisor in order to feel good about herself. And gradually she came to realize we're not going to raise our kids to be like that. We want to raise our kids to be able to know, not to be individualists, disconnected from a social milieu, of course not, to be part of a community, but not to be dependent on powerful people for approval. There are very successful, conventionally high-flying, rich, powerful individuals who still are desperately, desperately insecure. I mean, don't you want to get Trump on the psychoanalytic couch? And there are enormous egos at this university who are very successful and constantly trying to prove to someone who may not be in the room or even be alive, but I'm good. Look how smart I am. Look how successful I am. And they do it compulsively. Fill in the blank here. The question is, what leads to that? And how do we raise kids otherwise? So now my wife, even more than I, feels like the good job that parents do to their kids is just like fingernails being dragged down the blackboard. So we give our kids the stuff that's in the end of that little article that's in my book, The 5 Reasons Not to Say Good Job. That's real life, and it works. Sometimes we don't feel the need to say anything. Often the best part to be a really good parent or teacher is to know when to shut up. The best teachers have bite marks on their tongues. And sometimes we describe what it is that we've seen without evaluating it, and more often we ask questions. It's not a cold, chilly household, I assure you. Lots of hugs, lots of loves, but no verbal doggy biscuits for pleasing us.
Gordon Kraft Todd.
Hi, Mr. Kohn. One major criticism of the learning-based approach which you advocate over the achievement-based approach which you oppose is that it only works for privileged children who are constantly learning from their parents at home as well as from their teachers at school. Indeed, many cite studies which show that in underprivileged communities, standards-based teaching can actually teach students more effectively. What is your response to such evidence in light of the experience you have had as a teacher?
Standards-based learning is completely different from the standardized and test-driven approach to instruction that I oppose. The best and original examples of what might be called real standards-based learning came out of the work that Debbie Meyer and Ted Sizer have done in largely African-American communities, especially at first, where in order to graduate from some schools in New York City, like Central Park East and Urban Academy and the Beacon School and International School, the students have to do what in effect is like defending a doctoral dissertation. They work on these really careful, thoughtful projects demonstrating their mastery of the stuff they've learned across the disciplines. And they take questions, and if necessary, they go back and revise. That's real standards-based learning. But the question is, what do we mean by standards? I think there's an article in my book where I offer 4 questions to put to people who say they're for standards-based learning. Are the standards broadly conceived, like being thoughtful and able to make distinctions and connections, or are they a bunch of factoids that you got to commit to memory? Second, are they chosen because they really help promote deep understanding or because they're easy to measure? Third, are they one size fits all or are they flexible? Don't let the standardistos, as Susan Ohanian calls them, pull this little switch on you that they've pulled on many educators where they say all kids deserve a top-rate, terrific education, regardless of neighborhood and skin color and ethnicity. And then they quickly implement policies based on the premise that all kids should get the same education. That's not the same thing. And the fourth question about standards-based learning is, are they mandates or are they guidelines? Because if it's you do it because I told you to, which filters down to the superintendent and then to the principal and then to the teacher, you end up with that top-down approach that is profoundly undemocratic and mostly snuffs out innovative projects like the very ones that have been most successful with low-income kids of color. Right now, the standards and achievement-based approach defines high standards and achievement in terms of high scores on terrible tests, with the paradoxical and even tragic result that the students in schools that look like they're making progress are actually in more trouble than they were to begin with, because the most important kinds of teaching and learning have largely been squeezed out in a desperate effort to raise test scores. And when they succeed in raising scores, it looks like they're making progress when in fact they're slip-sliding away. Never mind that some of the best teachers have been squeezed out, and many of the kids have been forced out due to this unbelievably indefensible policy of saying, you pass this standardized test or you don't get a diploma. If I was trying to come up with a plan to make sure that mostly affluent, white, English-speaking kids graduated from high school, I couldn't do better than this accountability, allegedly standards-based approach. As to the first part of your question, no one, regardless of skin color or background, is handicapped by an approach that is primarily based on learning, on tapping the excitement that comes from trying to figure out why the soil samples came back different from this neighborhood as opposed to that neighborhood, or really wanting to get a grip on the questions having to do with why this poem grabs you from the first line and that one leaves you cold. That's all I'm arguing for. All, but of course it's a lot. That learning is based primarily on kids' excitement about learning. Excellence follows interest. You don't have to be white and from the suburbs to realize that that approach makes more sense than the mindless raise the bar approach that ends up mostly benefiting kids of privilege.
Brad Calkins.
This kind of builds on the previous question. On your website, you give many suggestions on how administrators, teachers, and parents can best minimize the damaging effects of standardized testing. However, there seem to be few practical alternatives for gauging the effectiveness of schools and of ensuring some level of accountability for individual public schools. How can the government identify the institutions that are not sufficiently educating their students and are in the greatest need of funding without the use of a standard criterion by which to judge them?
I have, for the last year or so, ever since the Many Children Left Behind Act began to be phased in, been challenging supporters of that act and of this whole accountability fad to name one school anywhere in the country that we learned was in deep trouble only from this latest wave of standardized testing, and we didn't know they needed help before. To pose the question is to realize the lie that underlies this talk about standardized criteria. Nell Noddings from Stanford says, try the windshield test. Drive by schools and try to guess which ones need help. If you need more than that, walk into the schools and smell the air and listen to the voices and look at the walls and get a sense after 20 minutes, is this a place where kids are buzzing with excitement about questions and ideas? Is it a place where the kids are talking with one another to learn, or a place where they're in fixed desks facing forward, hunched over worksheets, or listening passively to people lecturing at them? If you're a parent, watch and listen to what happens when the kids come home. Are they babbling excitedly about something they figured out how to do that day? When the kids argue in class, are they still arguing after the bell has rung? Never mind whether the kids are good readers, do they want to read? These are the primary indicators of school success without a single number having been attached to any of those criteria. And they work. They are good predictors from a social science point of view in terms of effective and not so effective schooling. But if you absolutely have to have numbers and more conventional criteria, in fact, there's a bunch of stuff, and I have some links on my website, perhaps not prominent enough, for people who have talked about and shown the practical implications of ways of assessing school quality and individual students' learning that are really based on student performance over time. Not a timed test, as in you have 45 minutes to complete this section. Here you're measuring speed, not thoughtfulness. Not a multiple choice test, which I believe are never useful. Multiple choice tests are designed so that many people who understand the material will be tricked into picking the wrong answer. They can be clever. Brian's applauding, so I know I haven't put my foot in my mouth too much here. They're designed, they can be clever, but they can't be authentic. You know, look, if the test was designed from far away and imposed on the kids and then sent back far away to be scored, that is standardized, but by no means a more reliable, valid, or useful indicator of the quality of teaching and thinking. And that's what the people who say the government has to make sure we have good schools, I agree with that. But they're using a criterion that measures what matters least. I mean, somewhere in this book, I think I mentioned 3 different studies showing that kids who do well on standardized tests in general are more likely to think in a shallow fashion than to think deeply. One of those studies was done with the SAT. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that, many of you high-flying SAT scorers are shallow. Oh, no, I wouldn't suggest that. Because it is always also true that some people who get high test scores are also deep thinkers, and some people who get low test scores are shallow thinkers. But 3 different studies with 3 different grade levels with a series of different tests have all replicated the findings that in general, it is more likely, all else being equal, that people who do well on standardized tests are less likely to read stuff over again when they didn't understand it the first time if they don't have to, are less likely to ask themselves questions while they read, are less likely to spontaneously try to connect what they're doing in school now to what they did earlier. And if I may extrapolate from this, the high test scoring people are less likely to ask, I don't get this, what does this mean? And more likely to ask, do we have to know this? Is this going to be on the final, or questions of that kind? Those students tend to do well on tests, but that's not what matters or what should matter. And in fact, the kind of learning I'm talking about is much more likely to lead to deep learning. Therefore, we need assessment that's worthy of that learning. Otherwise, the tail of testing wags the educational dog, and pretty soon you're teaching kids solely to raise score on the test, irrespective of whether the test is any good. We do have those. I mean, for example, you can have portfolios. Many of you may be familiar with this. I hope so from your own schooling, at least in elementary school. Why not in high school or college? I don't know the answer to that. But portfolios of the kind that artists and architects use are often used so that students can selectively collect examples of their learning and how it's changed and improved over time, thereby giving them, the teacher, and their parents a far more meaningful look into what they're doing and how they're doing. Now all you have to do if you're in the government is sample some of the portfolios from each school or district. You don't have to test them all to get a sense of the quality of education that is probably going on there. Now we can hold schools accountable by meaningful measures, and we can do so in a way that isn't based on bribes and threats that undermine quality.
Andrew English.
Hi, thank you for coming. School reform, as you well know, and as many of us here know, has been a major topic in the news in recent years. Yet, as you point out in What It Means to Be Well Educated, the issue has largely been framed by conservatives who push for large test regimes and privatization. Why is it that conservatives have been able to take control of the debate on school reform, and how do you and how can we move to open the discussion?
Well, I'm professionally very interested in education, but as a citizen, I'm interested in a lot of other stuff I read about in the newspaper. So now and then I have to slap myself, say education is not the only thing that counts, and even in order to understand what's going on in education public policy, I have to stand back and look at everything else that's happening. How have the conservatives managed to take control over the debate about what constitutes good education reform? How have they managed to take control of the debate about how to do Social Security, or deal with the environment, or transfer our treasure in this country to those who already have the most? Or how have they managed to frame the issues so that the invasion and occupation of another country is construed as fighting for democracy? These are all troubling questions that I think about all the time. Education is just one of many battles here. How have they managed to do that in this case? Apart from, having an amazing apparatus that's well funded in terms of think tanks and an entire pro-conservative news channel and at their disposal and many other things. Well, in the case of education, they did it very smart. They were very smart about it. During the Reagan administration in 1983, they came out with a report called A Nation at Risk that spoke in apocryphal, I should say apocalyptic terms, although many of the citations turned out to be apocryphal, about the extent to which public schools are horrible. And pretty soon people came to believe it. And the polls now show that average parents will say, yeah, public schools are terrible in this country. My own kid's school? Oh yeah, that one is actually pretty good. Most people say that. That disparity between the view of one's own school based on experience and one's view of American education based on coverage in the news media and what the politicians have been telling us speaks directly to the success of this agenda at causing people to discredit American education. Now, if my goal were to privatize schools and throw stuff over to the marketplace where the bottom line is what brings in profit to corporations, not what benefits children, that's exactly what I would have done. Because now, and it's going to be raised by an order of magnitude after the impossible to meet standards of the Many Children Left Behind Act, where huge proportions of schools are going to be publicly listed as failures. Now everything is set. The ground has been plowed, and you turn around and say, we are shocked to see how bad our schools are. Obviously what we need are vouchers, or whatever they're calling them this week, with some way to privatize them. So that's one way that they have been successful in framing the debate. They also take advantage of the fact that most parents who are even educated and quite caring have never really been invited to think about issues having to do with why lectures and quizzes and worksheets and textbooks of the kind they had when they went to school are not terribly effective at even meeting their own goal as parents of helping kids to become curious and critical thinkers and lifelong learners and ethical, happy, compassionate, responsible people. I always do this when I talk to teachers or parents. I start by asking, what are your long-term goals for the kids? Yeah, I think I said that somewhere here. I say it almost everything I write. And then we put the list on the board. Here's your long-term goals, not mine. So basically what I realized at some point that I do for a living is I say to different people about different issues, you say you want this, so how come you're doing that? This is how I make my living, which beats working, I can tell you that. But I'll say it about, you say you want your children to be compassionate, caring people. Here's the evidence. This is not something I thought up in the shower this morning. Here's the evidence showing that when you say good job and give kids stickers and stars, they become less caring and compassionate and generous than other kids. You say you want your kids to love learning and to do it well. Here's the evidence showing that when kids are trying to get good grades, they tend to pick the easiest possible task when they're given a choice, and they tend to lose interest in what they're learning. Something's got to give, either your goals or your practices. You can't have it both ways. And now let's talk about what other practices will help kids become caring, will help students love what they're doing, and so on.
David Stein.
Thank you for joining us, Mr. Kohn. The Washington Post profile about you noted that you are leading a one-man show in opposing the increased popularity of state-run standardized tests in American public schools. How do you cope with the challenge and the loneliness of fighting against something that nearly everyone seems to support?
Now, I may have to go back to that profile, which I haven't read for a while. I don't think that Jay Matthews said I'm leading a one-man show. I think that phrase came later in the article where he said, I kind of do my own bookings out of my Belmont house, and I'm not affiliated with an organization. I may be wrong. Maybe he did say that. But I don't think he implied, and even if he did, he would have been wrong, to say that I'm alone. I'm not. When I speak to auditoriums this big and bigger, filled with teachers and with parents about these issues, I got to tell you, when I started talking about the standards and testing issue about 4 years ago, I had been speaking and writing for a living before that on other issues. But when I started talking to teachers about standardized testing and the like, I started getting standing ovations. It's not because I suddenly became a better speaker. It's because I was tapping into something they already know. The closer you are to real classrooms, the more you know it's bullshit when they talk about accountability in the way they are. You can see it step by step. The teachers are more resistant to this rhetoric than the principals are. The principals more than the superintendents more than the school board people, and the school board people a lot more than the people whose idea of being in classrooms is a photo opportunity. The farther you get away from this, the more I look like some kind of wild-eyed radical who is just trying to tear down the system and is unrealistic and doesn't know what he's talking about and so on. It says something to me. I take some gratification in the fact that not only am I not alone, but the people most likely to nod and clap are the people who know the most from their experience about the issues I'm talking about. So the question then becomes not, how do I live with the fact that nobody else agrees with me, because that premise is false. The question becomes, how do I live with the fact that all of us who know better are losing? And that's a harder one to answer. And the public opinion polls show a growing disenchantment on the part of parents, not only teachers, about a lot of these issues. And it doesn't seem to matter. I mean, this is what I face in terms of, world events, too. When the people in the Bush administration, a small group of fanatics who finally got into a position of power and who seemed to be bent on what I can only describe as a desire for world conquest, proposed to invade a country that had done nothing to it and take it over, you never saw such an outpouring in the history of humankind. That's partly an artifact of the internet and the global village effect. But millions and millions of people all over the planet stood up as one and said no to Bush's war. And he said, he flicked them off like a mosquito and did exactly what he wanted to do. How many divisions does the Pope have? Stalin asked contemptuously. We struggle with this. Was that a moment of triumph because we're building another superpower called humankind? Or is it a moment for despair because humankind can be virtually unanimous in its condemnation of an unjust war, and it doesn't matter, the war is prosecuted anyway? Am I happy that we have more and more teachers understanding the need for quality learning and wanting themselves to be treated as professional educators instead of test prep technicians? Yes. I wish more of them would stand up and not capitulate to this. It depends. Rollo May, a philosopher, a psychologist who influenced me immensely, said, optimism and pessimism often speak to nothing so much as the state of your digestion today. And sometimes that's true for me too. Sometimes I wake up fired up by grassroots, truly democratic reforms by people who put aside the fact that they've got a child with the flu, or they're worried about their manager at work, or the fact that the roof needs to be repaired, and they put that aside and they stand up for what they believe, and they organize and they mobilize. And other days, I wonder how many people have to do that and how they have to do that in such a way where we can ultimately prevail in the things we're standing up for. In the case of education, I'm not so much feeling lonely as I am feeling frustrated, and it's not from the standardistas and the people who disagree with me. It's as a result of the people who agree privately with me but would never, ever stand up publicly and say what they know to be true. Fear is a powerful weapon, and the only thing more powerful than censorship is self-censorship, where people become the accomplices of those who have power and do ill by muzzling their own speech, holding back from doing what they know is right, and standing up against what they know is doing a disservice to children. I could probably ramble on about the schizophrenic reactions of feeling heartened and feeling disheartened, and not just about education, but other things. The question is, I guess, how do we act as if we can make a difference, knowing that even if we can't change the whole world by the end of this month, we can have an impact anyway.
Alex Misono.
Thank you for being with us today. Many of us at Harvard are likely victims of an American educational system that creates grade-obsessed, disinterested students, myself included, actually. What advice do you have to students like these who may be trying to recenter themselves?
I missed the last phrase, are trying to
Recenter?
recenter ourselves. I always preface advice to individuals, victims if you like, though there are some who would quibble at the notion of characterizing Harvard students as victims. But whenever I talk to individuals about what in the system can you do to minimize the damage, I always hate answering the question because most of the change needs to be structural rather than individual. My first book, which I wrote a perilously long time ago, called No Contest, which argues that competition is a bad thing in all areas of human life, when I started that process of grappling with competition, I was thinking about how much of the problem is because of competitive individuals and how much of the problem is structures that demand that we compete in order to succeed. And I thought of these two as being in some kind of symmetrical balance. But ultimately, as I read and thought about it, I came to think that that was wrong, that the structural component is far more important. If people came to agree with me, I said back then, that competition is destructive in all areas of human life, at work, at play, at school, at home, you would start to see books in Barnes & Noble with titles like 10 Steps to a Less Competitive You. In other words, fix yourself. That's the genius of the American system. People commit crimes, they're evil, lock them up. That doesn't work, then lock them up longer. Kids aren't learning or excited about learning, the teachers are bad, force them out. Make the test scores go up. We ignore people are out of work. They're desperately trying to figure out how to pay the rent and feed their kids. Then get a better job. Have a little work ethic, a little responsibility. You know? In other words, you overlook historical and political and economic causes of problems, the structural aspect, and you focus on individuals. I used to harumph when Noam Chomsky would say, I don't care what George Bush actually believes. It's irrelevant. But he has taken to its logical conclusion a structural analysis that says it's not that these are bad people. It's that systems select. We had a hilarious conversation at lunch, some of your teaching assistants and instructors here and I, where I was asked the hypothetical question, what would you do if you were president at Harvard? Hilarious question. Hilarious question. I'm going to be chuckling about this for weeks. But the point is, people who take the positions that I do, whether they're backed by research and experience or not is irrelevant, don't get to be president at Harvard. They don't get to run the op-ed page of the New York Times. They don't get to be in the U.S. Senate, with very, very few exceptions. Very few exceptions. So I hate answering these questions about, now that we're here in a structure that seems to undermine the foundations of learning, how can I try to protect myself from this? You know, when there's a factory spewing out pollution nearby, the question shouldn't be, where can we buy gas masks? You know? You see the analogy. Because you're good at SATs, of course, you see the analogy. What we need to do is organize and provide more and more students and then faculty, let's come back to the specific example that you offer in your question, of how do we change the grading system so it stops interfering with learning? What can we do? And it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Look, there's at least 4 colleges I can name off the top of my head that give no grades. None. And the students get into graduate schools and professional schools just fine. Just as high schools that give no grades. There aren't many, but there are some. You're wondering which. All right. Hampshire. Sorry? No longer, sadly. It's no longer at Santa Cruz. They just moved backward. They succumbed. And when Santa Cruz succumbs, it's not good news. Hampshire, Evergreen State in Washington, New College in Florida, and Alverno College for Women in Milwaukee. Those are the ones I know of. There may be more. But the point is their students do just fine. We need to know that. Well, what can we do here? How can we push? First of all, you as an individual can certainly elect to take as many courses as possible, pass-fail, so you're focused on the learning. And if there's a ceiling on the number of pass-fails you're allowed to take, that's an organizing issue that doesn't threaten the Harvard Corporation or the very existence of this institution. How many instructors can simply say this course is offered exclusively on a pass-fail basis? And how can we distribute and disseminate information to them about how a grade orientation pulls in this direction and a learning orientation pulls in that direction so that more instructors are willing to do this? Dick Lewontin, in biology, I assume he's still doing this, gives a B+ to everybody who comes and does the work. He announces it in the first day, and then he says, that's the last we're ever going to talk about grades. From now on, we just talk about biology. He neutralizes the effect of that. There are other ways that instructors can do this, and we can urge them to do so. But in the meantime, what you've got to do as the victim is to do everything in your power to make grades as irrelevant as possible